Hello everyone, and welcome to Is There Mining in a Sustainable Society? An introduction to the science and strategy of the natural step. My name is Tyler Seed, and I'm going to be the tech support for this presentation. The presentation will be presented by Chad Park. And just a few technical notes to get us started here. You should be able to see the screen, the presentation slides right now. It should say technical considerations across the top. And you should be able to hear my voice. If you can hear my voice, please find the raise your hand button and raise your hand. I can see a hand going up. I see some more hands going up. Looks good. Okay, some hands are going up. It looks like most everybody can hear me. You're also going to see a questions box there in your dashboard, and if you have any questions at any time, you can type them into the questions box and send them to me, and I will reply to them. And other than that, I'm going to turn it over to Chad.
Okay, thanks, Tyler. Thanks, everyone, for joining the webinar. My name is Chad Park, and I'm the Executive Director of the Natural Step in Canada. And over the next hour, I'm going to provide you with an introduction to some of the science and strategy that underlies the Natural Step's approach to sustainable development. I'm doing so with a little bit of a cheeky title called Is There Mining in a Sustainable Society? And we'll dive right into the content surrounding that question as we get into some of the material, but part of the reason to have this webinar is that the Mining Association of Canada had an interest in having an introduction to the Natural Step for some of its members. And so I know some of you who are on the call and on the webinar are members of the Mining Association of Canada, so welcome. And the Natural Step also presented or promoted the webinar, so there may be some additional people who were just interested in the topic. And welcome to you as well. The first thing I'll do is just a quick overview of the Natural Step, and as an organization, I won't spend too much time on this. I think many of you may be familiar with at least the organization, if not some of the content. The organization has been around for more than 20 years in the sustainable development field. It's originally started in Sweden, and now exists in 15 different countries around the world. It's recognized for its approach to sustainability that's very grounded in rigorous scientific principles, and some of the books that have been written about the Natural Step profile some of the organizations, especially the big businesses that have used this approach to inform the development of their sustainability strategies. So I will get in a little bit into some of that kind of application in a business context in my presentation as well. Our expertise as an organization, as a nonprofit organization, is in the social processes of sustainability-driven change. So what I mean by that is really the interaction among people within and between organizations. So getting groups of people to think differently about sustainability issues and to interact with peers and colleagues and strangers in the context of seeking solutions to sustainability challenges facing their organizations. So this is an organization that's fairly widely known in the sustainable development field and recognized by peers and partners for providing a clear voice in the commotion. Our mission in Canada is to accelerate the transition to a sustainable society as it is around the world, and we do that through three primary fields of activity, I guess. One is increasing sustainability literacy in a variety of contexts and fields within organizations and so on. And I'll talk more about our programs that achieve each of these three things later in the webinar. The second is to support the emergence of role models for sustainable business and sustainable communities. And again, this is for some people, this is what the Natural Step is most known for. And third is enabling collaborations for systems change. And again, I'll talk more about that later on in the webinar about how we do that. This is an overview of some of the organizations that we have worked with over the years, and you'll see that it's quite an array of organizations, from large multinational corporations to small rural municipalities and not-for-profit organizations. And the point of this slide is partly just to illustrate that it's an approach that has a wide range of applications and contexts, and a lot of different partners have used the natural steps approach. And the second point is to just point this out, which is a couple of the organizations that are profiled here are mining natural resource companies. And there are other mining companies and extractive companies that have also worked with the natural step more recently, including Suncor and Vale in Canada. And I say this partly because of the topic of this webinar, and to assure any of you who are with mining organizations that there is a track record here and some relevance to your organizations. And I can talk more about that as I get into this. So I'll just start off with the very big picture, which is the definition of sustainable development. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with this definition. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The key part of this sentence from the natural steps perspective is really this part, without compromising the ability of future generations. And while most people can buy into the broad definition by Brundtland and accept it as a good summary of what this is all about, operationalizing it has over the years been quite challenging. And this part that's highlighted in particular is something that we've been concerned with over the years, is sort of asking, how do we know if we're compromising the ability of future generations? Our material often those of you who are familiar with it will have seen a metaphor of a funnel, because it appears often in material from the natural step. And the funnel simply tells us that as time passes, there's an increasing pressure on organizations over time due to resource constraints and increases in per capita consumption and population and so on. And the challenge of sustainability and the challenge for individual organizations or sectors is, how do we navigate into the future in a way that assures that we're successful and that we don't hit the walls of the funnel, so to speak. And doing so requires a real strategic approach. Now, the funnel is basically a big giant forecast about what's coming and what's headed our way, and is really just meant as a metaphor. The challenge, of course, is that if we're headed in a direction that we're not happy about or excited about or that we're concerned about, then how do we plan for a future where we're actually more sustainable or in a different direction, I guess. And the funnel does introduce a planning methodology called forecasting, which most people are familiar with and use, and it's of course necessary in planning an organization. Forecasting is basically looking at past trends and doing our best to project them out into the future, and based on our best guess about what's coming for the future, positioning ourselves to the best advantage. The challenge with that is if the trends that we're analyzing and studying and understanding are taking us to a place that we don't want, then as they are in the case of sustainability, then relying on forecasting alone won't get us to a sustainable future. It's much like driving a car looking through the rear view mirror. So that does provide useful information for the drive, but if the future and the way in front of us is fuzzy and we don't know where we're going, then however clear we are about where we've come from, it's not as useful as getting clarity about where we're going. So the natural step approach uses a planning methodology called backcasting, which is intentionally called backcasting to contrast it with forecasting. And really, it's not rocket science. It's about beginning with the end in mind. So having a vision of what we want in the future, and on the basis of that, looking back to the present to understand where we are today relative to that vision, and then moving step by step in a strategic way towards the vision. So again, it's not highly complex, but in the case of organizations who are planning for sustainability, we often tend to rely more on forecasting than backcasting. Individuals tend to take this kind of approach when planning their own lives, and it kind of comes natural to us. But organizations have a harder time with it when it comes to sustainable development. We also use the metaphor of a lighthouse. Backcasting requires having some clarity about where we're going in order to make sure that we're strategic about getting there. So what the Natural Step has also provided is some way of helping and processes for helping develop vision and helping frame the vision in the context of sustainability, or in the context of what society needs in order to be sustainable. So the question is back to the question of Brundtland, or the definition of Brundtland, is how are we compromising people's ability to meet their future generations' ability to meet their needs, and what can we do to take a different course? The scientists who first started the Natural Step in Sweden went through an in-depth process with engaging dozens of leading scientists from a variety of disciplines to try to overcome the tendency that they were facing, and they observed then to the tendency for different interest groups to trot out their science and scientists to prove their opposing points of view on various issues related to sustainability or environmental and health issues and so on. And their thought was, surely the scientific community can play a more constructive role in helping planners and decision makers come to terms with what this whole concept means and what science can tell us about a sustainable society. So what they were really looking for was an articulation of fundamental principles of a sustainable society, starting with a starting point of scientific principles that everyone could agree on. And as you can imagine, it wouldn't be easy to get all those scientists to agree on anything. And their output was eventually endorsed by the King of Sweden and mailed out to every Swedish household and incorporated into the curriculum of every Swedish school. So the material was ultimately published in scientific journals, and has over the years now, for more than 20 years, been refined and further developed, and of course applied in a variety of contexts. So I'm just going to run through a very, very quick overview of some of the science that underpins the approach. And for those of you who weren't expecting it, hopefully you took note of the title of the webinar, because it did mention there was going to be some science. And for those of you who come from a scientific background, hopefully you can excuse the oversimplification I'm about to go through, but this is giving a high-level overview of some of the fundamentals of the science behind the Natural Steps approach. Of course, you can get a lot more detail on it by coming to our website and doing some research around it, which we're happy to direct you towards afterwards. So what do we know about this system we call Earth and life on Earth? The first thing that those scientists could agree on is that there are two primary forms of life on the planet. Of course, there are actually more, but this is boiling it down to plants and animals. There's also fungus, mushrooms, and bacteria, and so on. But for the sake of this exercise, we can say there's plants and there's everything else. And there's an elegant relationship between those forms of life, where the waste of one is the food of another, and so on. So we eat plants and we return the favor by helping provide the nutrients that they need to grow. The other thing that scientists could agree on is that this is an open system with respect to energy. So there's one input into the system overall, and one input alone, and that's energy from the sun, which gets dissipated off in the form of heat. And that there's one form of life on Earth that has the capacity to harness that one input, and that's plants. The other thing is that it's a closed system with respect to matter, so nothing disappears. All the matter we have here is the same stuff that's been here for millions and billions of years. It's just been reordered. And secondly, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that everything tends to disperse. Everything tends to break down. So that raises the question of if we're in a closed system with respect to matter and everything's gradually breaking down, then why is it that we're not existing in some kind of toxic, soupy mess? And the reason we're not is because, as I said, the plants have the ability to harness the one input into the system, which is energy from the sun, and to create order through photosynthesis. And so it's actually, in the case of natural capital, that photosynthesis pays the bills and actually drives these cycles. Now, where these are relatively quick sun-driven cycles, there's also much slower cycles in nature, which are geological cycles, where matter from the Earth's crust that's been deposited over millions of years gradually comes up to the Earth's surface through volcanoes and weathering, and then goes back down into the lithosphere through sedimentation and mineralization. Those kind of cycles occur over much slower time scales, and the natural cycles on top that form life on planet Earth have come to exist within certain flows of geological cycles. So why do we cover this? So the crux of it is that from a scientific perspective, sustainability is about the ability of human society to continue indefinitely within these natural cycles. And we wouldn't be talking about sustainability if this were occurring. What the scientists who first created the consensus that led to the natural steps approach, what they were trying to do was to understand as far upstream, what are the things we're doing that are causing these cycles to break down, causing all the downstream effects that we know as climate change and acid rain and so on and so forth. The good news is that there are only 4 ways that we influence these natural cycles, and so if we exist within the middle of the cycles, the first way that we disrupt them or influence them is that we take relatively large flows of materials from the Earth's crust, use them in our products and processes in a way that's faster than they go back down. Faster than they go back down into the Earth's crust. And if we are introducing them into natural systems faster than they go back down, then they're going to increase in concentration. And that is that's the first challenge from a sustainability perspective, from a scientific perspective, the first sustainability challenge. The second, and I'll elaborate on each of these 4 in just a moment. The second thing that we do is we've become brilliant at combining substances and molecules into compounds that many of whom are foreign to nature and nature's never seen before, and therefore has a tough time breaking them down within the regular cycles of nature. And again, if we introduce such substances into natural systems faster than nature can break them down, then they're going to increase in concentration. And it's that increase in concentration that's the sustainability problem. Whether something is toxic today or not, if it's increasing in concentration, then at a certain point it's going to become toxic. So it's the concentration level that's the real sustainability problem. The third thing is that and this is probably the one that's most intuitive for people to understand, is that we physically inhibit nature's ability to run cycles. So if we over-harvest renewable resources like forests or fish, or if we pave over ecosystems and so on, if we do so in a way that that consistently and systematically erodes nature's capacity to run these cycles, then that's going to be a sustainability problem, and is a sustainability problem. So these first three are ecological mechanisms. The fourth one deals with how we relate to one another as human beings within our societies and economy. And what that says is that we create barriers to people meeting their needs worldwide. And as long as we do so on a systematic basis, that can really act like a gas pedal on the other three. So the extreme illustration of this is a farmer who, a poor farmer in Brazil who has to choose between saving the rainforest or chopping down a bit of the rainforest in order to grow some food to feed their family. They're always going to choose to do that, as would we. And so that just acts like that mechanism can act on a global scale, acts like a gas pedal on the other three. And we'll go more into needs in just a second as well. So again, only 4 ways that we actually intervene into natural cycles to cause them to break down. And I guess the question is, so what? But that understanding allowed the scientists to articulate the system conditions for sustainability. So from a scientific perspective, we can say that in a sustainable society, basically, those 4 things are not happening. So nature is not subject to systematically increasing concentrations of substances extracted from the Earth's crust, concentrations of substances produced by society, degradation by physical means, and in that society, people are not subject to conditions that systematically undermine their capacity to meet their needs. I know this is a mouthful, so I'm going to go through each of them in a little bit more detail. But before I do that, just to illustrate that what is noteworthy about this is that, of course, we are not achieving these system conditions today, and that's the point. But how they become useful, and this starts to get at the answer to the so what question, is that we can set them up as innovation guidelines that help frame the future state of sustainability that we're working towards in our businesses and industries and communities. And doing so, as I'll show, helps to give a lot more rigor and direction to the ongoing effort of trying to make continuous improvements to a more sustainable state. So as I said, I'll go through that in more detail in just a sec, but before I do, a quick overview of a little bit more detail on each of the 4 principles or 4 system conditions. And I'm going to spend a bit more time on this first one given the topic because this is where we get into that question about, is there mining in a sustainable society? So the first, for many people, the first review of this principle suggests automatically to them, because we're talking about mined materials, essentially, substances extracted from the Earth's crust. Their quick review of this tells them that this is telling us that there's no mining in a sustainable society. But if you read it really carefully and you understand the sort of the depth of the science that underpins this, you'll see that it doesn't actually say that there are no mined materials in a sustainable society. What it says is that nature's not subject to systematically increasing concentrations of mined materials, and that the distinction is very, very important. So what this is really telling us, and what this really means, is that we need to, over time, to move towards a sustainable society, we need to move from a situation where there's relatively inefficient uses of mined materials to very efficient uses of them. Secondly, that we need to move from a situation where there's relatively dissipative uses of mined materials so that they are released into natural systems to ones where, to a future state where mined materials are kept in tight technical cycles. The third point is that we need to make a transition, as a rule of thumb, from scarce metals to more abundant metals, and that the reason for that is it's not a hard rule, but it's that it's much more challenging for us to manage scarce metals in tight technical cycles in a way that protects nature from increasing concentrations of them than it is for abundant metals, where nature is basically made of those metals. And I'll say more about this in just a second. And then it tells us, of course, that we need to move from a current state where we're very reliant on fossil fuels to for our energy to a future where we're driven more by renewable energy. So on this point about which metals and scarce and abundant metals, again, the point here is that natural systems are of course, metals exist in natural systems in varying concentrations. Certain metals are very, very scarce in nature. Others are very, very abundant. And our ability to, as a human society, to increase the concentration of very abundant metals, to increase their concentration in nature is relatively much smaller than our ability to increase scarce metals. So again, what it means is, for example, mercury, which is a scarce metal in nature, any kind of little release into natural systems is going to dramatically increase concentrations. Whereas metals like iron or aluminum, that exist in very high concentrations in nature, we would have a hard time increasing their concentrations through human activity. So the scientists, some of the scientists who first developed this approach and this line of thinking actually did a whole analysis of every element in the periodic table of the elements and analyzed its basically our capacity to increase their concentration in nature. So at the top, these are just a few pulled out for sample. You'll see aluminum, and at the bottom is mercury. And again, that's just to illustrate the vast difference there, where aluminum exists in very high concentrations in topsoil and comes out as well through weathering. We release about 18,000 kilotons per year in mining, from mining activity, and fossil fuel exploration and so on. But that's a relatively small amount to what exists in nature. So the far right column tells us that our ability to increase the concentration of aluminum in nature is very, very small. Whereas the contrast is down at the bottom is mercury, which exists in very small concentrations in nature. Therefore, any kind of introduction into natural systems through human activity is going to cause a sustainability challenge. So again, this is just there's a lot more to this, but I just wanted to provide go a little bit deeper into this one system condition in order to illustrate the point that this system condition does not actually say that we shouldn't have mining in a sustainable future. In fact, mined materials can and probably should play a very important role in a sustainable future. They're durable and can be recycled and reused over and over and kept in tight technical cycles. That doesn't mean that they get a free pass, because the challenge is not so much is it a sustainable material or an unsustainable material. In fact, the natural step would say there's no such thing as a sustainable or unsustainable material. Rather, what there is the sustainable or unsustainable management of materials. So it's how we use the materials, not so much whether we use them. And that same thinking applies to the materials in question with the second principle. And I won't go into as much detail here, but these are the persistent chemical compounds that nature's never seen before. And again, it doesn't say we shouldn't have chemicals in a sustainable future. Rather, if and as we do, we need to make sure we shift from inefficient uses of them to efficient uses of them, from persistent and unnatural compounds where possible to those that are abundant and can break down easily, and from dissipative uses of the ones that are persistent to keeping them in tight technical cycles. The third system condition talks about the degradation by physical means. And again, this doesn't say we shouldn't have forestry in a sustainable future. Rather, this one again is, I think, more intuitive for most people, that we need to manage the resources we use from ecosystems in a way that protects the ecosystem's ability to function. The fourth one is different than the rest and is challenging. It's probably the one where there's been the most ongoing research and development within the international network of organizations and scientists that work with the natural step. And again, this doesn't say that a future state is, in a future state, lions are going to hug lambs and it will be some kind of utopia. Rather, it's that we have built a society that doesn't systematically erode people's capacity to meet their needs. So these are the kinds of transition. We talk about needs and can get into a whole discussion there, of course. And one of the examples I'll show later from a mining company takes this in a whole bunch more depth. But a real quick point about human needs, and this is to say most people would understand human needs using something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the natural step prefers an understanding of human needs based on a social scientist called Manfred Max Neef, who says that there are 9 fundamental human needs that are the same throughout history and or across history and throughout cultures. What's different is how, in different points in history and in different cultures, how we satisfy those needs. So these are the 9 fundamental human needs, and Max Neef's work also tells us that you can't, that a healthy human being is not it doesn't have a poverty of any of these needs over time. So usually we think of poverty relating to subsistence, of course, and it does, and it is. But that ultimately, if we lack for freedom or for identity or for even an interesting one given our modern society, idleness, over time that that a social system can be eroded. And again, there's a lot more to this than I'll share here, but this just gives a little bit of an overview of some of the kind of holistic approach to human needs that forms part of this science. So once again, here are the 4 system conditions for sustainable society, and now it gets into so what, and the so what comes back to this picture where the 4 principles can be set up and used as frames for within a business or an organization to help provide the constraints for creativity. So it doesn't tell us anything about what the future looks like for our business, but what it tells us is that ultimately, to be sustainable, we need to be aligned with those principles. And so we can paint the picture of our business in a sustainable future in a way that aligns with those 4 system conditions, and doing so can be a driver for creativity and innovation and value creation. And that's what the organizations that have worked with the Natural Step over the years have done. The reason they've done so isn't because it makes them feel good or because it's somehow morally the right thing to do. It may be that as well, but the primary business driver for doing so comes back to this metaphor, which tells us that there are hard business and strategic reasons for being holistic and forward-thinking about sustainability. And the businesses that do so and think in the most advanced way and sophisticated way about what it implies for their business have the opportunity to really capture opportunity, because this is not about preferences so much. The future state in the funnel, in a future state, human beings are going to have the same needs they have today, but it's a grand entrepreneurial challenge to figure out how we're going to meet them in a way that doesn't erode the natural and social systems upon which we depend. So it's a big strategic and entrepreneurial challenge, and the backcasting methodology that I introduced earlier gives us a way of trying to capture some of that opportunity and that value, and to do so in a way that it makes smart business sense. So I already mentioned this slide about beginning with the end in mind, looking back to the present, and then moving step by step towards the vision. And as we do this part about moving step by step, the natural step approach encourages businesses to really think very hard as we make investments and decisions about at least these three questions. The first is it moving us in the right direction? So is it getting us closer to alignment with the system conditions for sustainability? Is it somehow reducing our dependence on fossil fuels? Is it somehow closing or bringing a material into closer to being in a tight technical cycle, and so on? Is it helping to protect human beings from having their needs undermined, and so on? So there's a whole process of making sure that what we're doing is moving us step by step in the right direction. Secondly, a flexible platform. Is it a flexible platform? And this means nobody's going to achieve sustainability in one move or with one single investment, but we need to make sure that the investments we make and the steps we take give us the greatest degree of flexibility to make future moves, because the conditions are going to change, economics are going to change, and we don't want to tie up too much capital, for example, in partial solutions that make it very difficult to adapt and to take subsequent steps into a more sustainable future. So flexibility is paramount. And third, it doesn't do anyone any good if a company that's trying to become more sustainable suffers financially or economically in the process of doing so. So it's important that every move be assessed, of course, from the perspective of return on investment. We can think of return on investment in a financial sense, of course, and also in a social or political sense, as in creating the conditions for future steps along the lines of the flexible platform point. So I'll just have a couple more slides that kind of illustrate how this has been applied in the context of mining organizations, and then a couple more slides about activities, and that should give us at least 10 minutes, maybe 15 at the end for questions. What this whole approach implies is a widening of the zone of stewardship and innovation, especially for a mining and resource company. And I think most mining and resource companies are already thinking in this way, and this means thinking beyond just the impacts of the asset, as in the mine, but also starting to think of a zone of stewardship that incorporates the region around the mine, and ultimately the resource or the material itself. What's the ultimate fate of that material? Is it ultimately increasing in concentration in nature, and how is it used, and so on, and in what kinds of products? So that's that widening zone of stewardship, where we go from things that a company can directly control to things that it can influence to things that it just happens to care about but still affect its business. And that widening zone of stewardship also introduces a widening zone of innovation opportunity. So of course, innovations about efficiency gains and so on the asset level, but also new kinds of partnerships and relationships that go far beyond just the mine and also into the value chain and the supply chain and so on. This little graphic is from an analysis that was done with a mining company where a natural step advisor in Australia did a detailed analysis of 16 different activity areas within the business that were sort of being undertaken already within the Sustainable Development or Corporate Responsibility mandate, and kind of map them on this chart to say, well, these are all things that you're doing, as many do, on the asset level, and there's some that are incremental or beyond incremental, and then there's this other zone of things that you're doing that are around material stewardship and so on that are really leading edge. So it's a way of kind of benchmarking in the mining sector. Of course, this is all about systems innovation, and I won't go into the detail of this other than the bottom point to just say that this whole innovation approach really builds on the principles of industrial ecology, industrial symbiosis, and collaboration across normal business boundaries, where you can look at the value that's created throughout a value chain at different steps of the value chain and really understand the impacts in those different parts of the value chain and try to be very systematic about how we're generating value, increasing value, and minimizing or lessening the impacts. And so that's that relationship between value and impact that's key. And that's the source of innovation. The Natural Step in Canada has a network of associates who do consulting with different businesses and organizations, and really take them through at a high level this kind of process where we apply that backcasting methodology. So understanding what's the value of a strategic commitment to sustainability, so the business case, and then how do we capture this value, and that's kind of applying this backcasting and visioning methodology. And then how do we embed sustainability into different elements of the organization. And this kind of process, for example, was done with the bauxite and alumina division of Alcan just before it became Rio Tinto Alcan a number of years ago. This is my summary slide about the content, and then I have a couple more before I close. So what this is telling us, this is all telling us, or the approach is telling us, is that sustainability places intelligent constraints on a business. Whether we acknowledge them or not, it does. And so it's better to place the sort of value over impact constraints on yourself than have others impose the impact constraints on you, as in stay ahead of the policy curve and have a sense of understanding what's coming in that way, and so on. And constraints are sometimes referred to as or thought of as a negative, but in this sense, it's really meant as the positive, as in the sense that it drives innovation. So constraints really provide the boundaries for an innovation or creative process, and that's what the system conditions do in a way that we've laid out before earlier. The second point is that, of course, we live and operate in a complex web of relationships, so it's best to be the spider, not the fly. And the whole exercise here is really a way of helping to develop an ability to recognize patterns and to understand that complexity in a way that it otherwise might appear too complex. And so the framework can be a useful tool in that sense, helping people to be the spider, not the fly. And the last key point to mention is you can't create a future that you can't imagine. And so a successful journey needs a sense of direction and a desired destination. One of my colleagues from the Natural Step in Australia, when we were working with Rio Tinto Alcan, used the example of health and safety to illustrate the whole backcasting approach. And he said, we don't, as a mining company, we don't set a goal of 10% fewer deaths in our operation than we had last year. We tend to set goals that are more like 0 deaths, no harm, that type of thing, and have that big, bold sense of what we need to accomplish drive all of our efforts to improve health and safety and so on. And he thought he used that as a parallel to say, isn't it interesting though how for pretty much every other sustainability issue or constraint we don't tend to use that same approach. So it's trying to apply that kind of thinking more broadly across the organization. And those who can get to the future first will win. So one last little set of slides here about an upcoming event. So our programs and services in Canada, the Natural Step, include sustainability learning programs, a whole series of courses and workshops, both in person and online. And advisory services, as I mentioned, strategic consulting that's done via a network of associates. And thirdly, a foundation-funded program that's called the Sustainability Transition Lab, which is a multi-stakeholder approach to solving complex challenges that no single organization can address. And I can speak more about that if anyone asks a question about it. So one upcoming event we wanted to tell you about before signing off. The MBA we have one of our learning programs is called an MBA Sustainability Leadership Bootcamp, and the next one is happening August 26th to 29th in Toronto. This is the first time where we're going to do the MBA Sustainability Leadership Bootcamp with a particular theme and a focus on a particular sector, and it will be mining. So this is the agenda. It's basically a 4-day program to help people, and I'll show a slide that says which kind of people, but helps them become more effective sustainability champions as they engage in the work world, and goes into some of the content that I just presented in a whole bunch more depth, and also into a whole bunch of exercises and cases about how to be effective change agents. So this will be MBA students or recent graduates who are learning about or interested in becoming more effective sustainability change agents, and then also early to mid-career professionals who want to do the same. And the program is sponsored by the Suncor Energy Foundation, and in the past has also been supported by organizations like Synovus and Vale, and those sponsors tend to provide some of the suggestions for content and case studies, and also to send a few of their own staff to attend the session. So it's a really good learning environment, and I encourage any of you who are either interested as an individual or on behalf of your organization to learn more about it, and we'll send out some materials about it. We're promoting it right now and looking for the participants to attend. So we're accepting applications for registration right now through our website. That's all I have for slides. So thank you for bearing with me through a fairly long presentation, and I've left about 10 minutes for any initial questions if anyone has any, and we'll be sending out some material afterwards to follow this up.
Hello. So if you have a question, this is Tyler again, by the way. If you have a question, please enter it in your question box there. There should be a question box in the dashboard. So yeah, if you have a question, please enter it there, and then I will unmute your microphone, and you can ask Chad directly. And if you're having trouble finding the question box, the chat box, please raise your hand, and I'll unmute you. So our first question is from Mar Martinez de Saavedra. I'm sorry, I don't have the whole rest of your name. Saavedra Alvarez. Yes. Hello, you're on the line.
Hello, how are you? Can you actually hear me?
Yes, we
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Yep.
well, thanks very much for a great presentation. I'm actually a marine biologist, but I've been involved in mining reclamation as a remote sensing analyst doing, long-term monitoring. So I've been doing this for about 10 years now. And I'm most interested in this because I'm doing my master's right now with railroads on environmental practice. And I am really interested in knowing how would you suggest that we can communicate these to other mining companies. You mentioned BHP and Alcan, like there is so many out there. And what do you suggest that we can engage and coax them? This is a very tough crowd.
Thank you.
You know that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I understand. Thank you for your question. And I think, I think this is sort of the grand challenge of every sustainability change agent in any capacity, right? Is how do we get more people to adopt more advanced sustainability practices and so on. So there's no, if I had the silver bullet in the easy answer to your question, I'd probably be. But on the other hand, I can say that the I think a couple of things come to mind. One is increasingly to be able to position some of these issues as good for business, and I think there are more and more examples of that, more and more resources. So that some of the material, for example, of Bob Willard that really focuses on the business case for sustainability, I think is really helpful in that regard, and most of the and that's why our process that our associates use often starts there. There's I'll just draw that one forward here again just to illustrate it. Really, most people are hearing about sustainability, and whether they're paying attention to it or think it's relevant or not is a whole other thing. But to the extent that they're hearing about it and that they may actually be frustrated by the term, that can really be an opportunity, because if you can provide some clarity about what it means, and especially what it means for the business and what the opportunity is, I think that's the real that's where some interest and value can be created. And Bob Willard's book on he has one called The Sustainability Advantage that talks about the business case, and another that's called The Sustainability Champions Guidebook, and that's about how to be an effective internal agent for change within a company. So I would recommend those materials as part of the answer. And I guess the other is just to be able to more broadly tell the stories of those organizations that are actually capturing some value from a strategic approach to sustainability, and there are more and more of them, I think. So those aren't easy answers, but I know that the Mining Association of Canada has a program called Towards Sustainable Mining. And,
yes.
And so that sets out a series of activities and benchmarks and so on that many mining companies have signed up for, and so working from the standpoint of what people already know and are already comfortable with, I think can be a good basis for the conversation as well. And I think that's part of what this approach that I've just presented helps with, because this doesn't require, in a way, it requires it helps bring clarity to the issues, but it doesn't require an entirely new stream of activity. I mean, you can build from what's already going on and start to integrate things in a more strategic way.
Thank you. I really appreciate all your answers and insight, and I do realize this is an overwhelming task, because we are trying to actually change attitudes and behaviors that they're really entrenched in a very mechanistic worldview. So I understand this is not easy, and yes, I agree with you. You must have heard of the Jim Hogan, doing the right thing and promoting that, and at all levels. And I think mining industry is slowly changing, although, as you know, that Bill, I think it was Bill 300 that was killed, making mining companies responsible, not just in Canada but overseas. So the whole thing is changing, but I guess it's too slow for me. I would like to see it a bit faster, but I understand these things take time. So I really thank you for this wonderful presentation and for, giving us more ideas and strategies. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for being online.
And if anybody else has any questions, you can enter them in your question box. But it doesn't look like anybody else has any questions.
Okay. Well, let's one last chance for any questions, and otherwise we will wrap it up. We'll send out, for everyone who signed up, we'll send out the materials and some follow-up material as well. And thank you very much for taking the time to be online with us, and we'll see you in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.